What is up, what is up, what is up? It is your boy RC Apologist here, and we are going with this nice little discussion known as Theological discussion. Now, if you're going to notice a little bit of the sound differences that is in this episode, that is because we are deciding to do this episode live from a form of, well, mobile outgoings, if you will. We are at my station on break, so as a result we're in an area where there's going to be a little bit of some sound because that's just sometimes how we roll, and of course the studio of which I'm not saying where because I'm not going to give my location out. So I guess you could say I am at an undisclosed location, but that being said and done, let us get into it. It's been an interesting week of events that we have had, especially those of you who have seen the Theological discussion episode that it was live streamed Friday, and then the podcast format was published yesterday. The episode was definitely quite interesting, and I would just have to say that I'd recommend if anyone's looking for a good biblical inerrancy discussion is to go check that out, because it dealt with a lot of objections by skeptics such as the person that was in the conversation that had doubts about biblical inerrancy, and so we deal with these issues from a biblical perspective. So recommend checking that out. Another thing that I want to mention before we get into the episode is a book that I've been reading that I've got about a week ago, called Introducing the Apocrypha, Message, Context, and Significance by David A. Da Silva. It is the second edition. It is about 400 pages long almost, and it deals with a lot of interesting issues, especially concerning the Apocrypha and the canonical status of the Apocrypha. So especially concerning the question of, is the Apocrypha itself, canon or not, all kinds of these things. And I really would recommend this book to anybody who is looking to study the issue, because along with this, of course, I have the King James Apocrypha back at my place. So yeah, we're going to be doing what we do usually, and see where that takes us. Alright. So, that being said, and there's a reason why I have that with me for this particular episode. Alright, so let's go into some of the things. In Twitter news, there had been some drama that bashed out on there after making a post that, a lot of Catholic apologists will get offended by, and that is with the tweet that had the picture of the flag, of the Catholic flag, and then of course I just said alongside it, the flag of false doctrine. Alright, so this definitely was met with criticism by people. Some people, of course, were able to handle it and just be, and I could handle, the casual messing around and such, like the Catholic Fusionist, for example, a good friend of mine. It's had like a picture of a tulip and said the flower of false doctrine. So I'm like, I see what you did there. So then you have other people that come in saying, you have one guy who was just laughing and being all mocking, who was named Stephen Doe the Black, however you pronounce it. His Twitter username is at @steel_dragon SDX. And he was just like, being all this. And as soon as I said, he's telling me, go to Mass, I say only when you prove to me that the Mass is biblical. He responds with, when you can tell me which books should and should not be included in the Bible based on an infallible source, we can have that discussion. So then we get to the discussion there, and I said, okay, here we go. Romans chapter 3, verse 2. The Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. I mean, and when it says that they are entrusted with something, they are given trust by God over these things to be responsible over it. And so the Jews were held with the canonicity of the Bible of the Old Testament. Now, this got into a long conversation of which you can check for yourself in our threads that we've had. It was definitely something. And of course, another one was from a guy named Monty, his thing being at Monty, where apparently he retweeted the thread and said, local Protestant. Now, I'm sure you can understand what he's trying to say there. It's not the way of saying thought as in thinking a thought, but something that sounds like that. Local Protestant is upset the Catholics found the buried Bible before him and that no one will listen to him as a personal pope. So this guy is just, like ranting and making a mockery of the whole thing when he doesn't really, offer where I've said that, that these Catholics found a buried Bible. I never said that. He's just, this is just the typical emotional Roman Catholic response when you get some of these issues placed there. And I never claimed to be a personal pope at all either. I, in fact, abhor and despise the idea of anyone trying to let themselves be viewed as a personal pope or as an imam or as a sheikh, which people are to go to for certain fatwas and declarations and such. So, people deciding to just be very emotional in their response, and they just absolutely can't handle the truth sometimes. So, we had been getting something for this conversation. And as I was reading the book that I mentioned from David De Silva concerning this Stephen Dowd the Black, and we were continuing to have the conversation on the Apocrypha, the main thing that he kept bringing up as his objections was this, because I would state not only that of what I stated earlier with Romans 3:2, we also have the testimony of Josephus and Philo of Alexandria to affirm the Protestant canon versus the apocryphal canon. And the objections that seem to follow are these. One is, you're going to Josephus and Philo, Jews that denied Christ as the Savior? You blaspheming heretic, why would you do such a disgusting thing? You should not listen to the words of people because they denied the Lord Jesus Christ, which, again, is problematic because that actually commits the genetic fallacy. Now, the genetic fallacy is basically to appeal to prejudices surrounding something's origin, and which is another red herring fallacy. And this fallacy has the same function as an ad hominem, but applies instead to perceptions surrounding something's source or context. In other words, judging something good or bad on the basis of where it comes from or from whom it comes. So, whoops, something just happened there with our computer there. Alright, so let me just clock out of there. Alright, anyways, as I was saying before that happened, so he's committing the genetic fallacy by saying, well, you have this right here, and that kind of is a problem because, well, Josephus, the man of which this source is coming from, denied Jesus was the Savior. And because of that, that means we don't trust or rely on that. That is, again, genetic fallacy. That is using fallacious reasoning and argumentation to come to your conclusions. So, sure, if you want to use that argumentation, fine, but it's logically fallacious. And I think that, if we're going to be consistent, we should be completely logical in our reasoning and not having to resort to fallacies to defend our position. So that's the one thing, and that's how you easily debunk that, is to point out that that's just simply fallacious reasoning. And that's like saying, I can dismiss the Catholic Church's authority based on certain scandals that happened in the past. And I hope and pray to God that a Catholic apologist would take me on that and say, well, that's committing, the genetic fallacy just because of something that happened in the past or something that's on their name or anything like that. That you shouldn't judge the entire authority or the entire church just because of one thing. I agree. So, Catholics, let's be consistent. The second point that is usually mentioned by the apologists of Rome is the issue about, that there's different canons. That there's you have one set of Jews that have something, and then you have another set of Jews that had a different canon. Which one's, more viable? Okay, so a few things about this. Because one of them they keep saying is that, at least the way he said it was, there is the Palestinian Jewish canon, and then you had the Septuagint canon. The Septuagint was never a canon. The Septuagint is a translation of a collection of works. And just because a bunch of works are in there doesn't automatically mean that it's part of a canon. It's just like saying, for example, that if you have a collection of works of C.S. Lewis in one book, and all of a sudden with the Chronicles of Narnia there, and then you have in an appendix or another book that's in there, you have Mere Christianity or the Screwtape Letters in this collection, should that then be reason to consider Mere Christianity or the Screwtape Letters as part of the same canon as the Narnia series by C.S. Lewis? Someone would clearly and logically say, no, that's not the case. It's just part of this collection of works by the man who authored it, C.S. Lewis. And so for the Septuagint, it was a Greek translation of Jewish writings that weren't just simply of the scriptures, but of different Jewish writings that were of importance to the Jews. Now, concerning one of these canons that they try to go to, called the Alexandrian Jewish canon, like I said, you have the Alexandrian Jews. Now, on page 17 of David De Silva's Apocrypha book. Now, note, this is in the middle of when he's going over the issues of this particular canon and the canonicity issue of the Old Testament. He mentions this, quote, "A fifth persistent factor that has clouded this discussion is the concept of an Alexandrian Jewish canon of Scripture that was broader than the Palestinian Jewish canon. This is based on a lack of clarity about the meaning of the term Septuagint and can be illustrated by considering a severe misstatement of the facts." And then it provides a quote saying, "Both Judaism and Christianity began by simply using the deuterocanonical writings as part of the biblical canon. It is hard to say when this kind of usage began. It was certainly not later than the translation of the Septuagint, which was from 285 to 247 BC. Since the translation made by Jews for Jews and Gentiles includes the deuterocanonical writings." So there are two scholars that has pointed out, Oikonomos and Konstantelos, who so far from what has been identified seem to be part of the Orthodox Church. Now, then of course, De Silva continues and says, quote, "The author of this quotation has assumed that the Septuagint, in the sense of that collection of texts known from codices Alexandrinus, Sinaiticus, and Vaticanus, or in the sense of the critical editions available today, was the Septuagint of the Jewish community of the 3rd century BCE. This is, however, a grave misstep, because the work undertaken in the 3rd century BCE in Alexandria involved only the Greek translation of the Pentateuch, clearly the scope envisioned by Letter of Aristeas, an early, if embellished, account of the translation project. Moreover, the quotation involves its author in a paradox. It would be impossible for the 3rd century BCE version of the Septuagint to contain any of the Apocrypha, since they were almost all written between 200 BC and 100 CE. Also, telling in the argument against an Alexandrian Jewish canon is that Philo of Alexandria, the Jewish commentator par excellence, never quotes from the Apocrypha. So there's another thing. I mentioned Philo of Alexandria, and if he is an Alexandrian Jew, who therefore would be following this Alexandrian Jewish canon, of which, of course, the person said, why accept Philo? He denied Christ. So, regardless, he would have still then affirmed an Alexandrian Jewish canon, if the Alexandrian Jewish canon did affirm, indeed, the apocryphal books, as some proponents could proclaim. Some people say it's only the Palestinian Jewish canon that contains the Protestant Old Testament canon, and that the Alexandrian Jewish canon can contain the Apocrypha, since the Septuagint contained the Apocrypha. But Philo of Alexandria, he had access to the Apocrypha in the Septuagint, and he could only read the Septuagint because he was not well versed within the Hebrew language, but rather in the Greek. He was a Hellenized Jew, after all. So he never quotes from the Apocrypha. Not only that, but in his own writings himself, he identifies the particular canon that is to be used, and that was recognized as authoritative to be laid up into the temple, and is what is viewed as canon by his predecessors. And that was the Protestant canon that we have, and is excluding the Apocrypha, or the deuterocanonical works, as some of the Catholic apologists would say. And finally, he continues by saying, quote, "Indeed, his focus is overwhelmingly on the Torah, with occasional references to the prophets, Psalms, and other texts that would become known as the Jewish canon." And then continues to say, "The Septuagint codices mentioned above cannot be used as evidence for a pre-Christian Alexandrian Jewish canon that included the Apocrypha." And of course, his footnote on this is that this has been decisively refuted in Sundberg's 1964 work. See also McGlynn, 2001. So actually, we'll just let the Sundberg work be referenced. So let's go into the work. So the cited sources, where we have Sundberg. So that way, hopefully, we got a full name. All right. This is the one thing I like about the references. Okay, A.C. Sundberg is his name. The Old Testament of the Early Church, published by Harvard University Press. Okay. So, the codices that are mentioned, which is Alexandrius, Sinaiticus, and Vaticanus. Vaticanus, of course, is being one that's, at the Vatican itself. These things cannot be used for evidence for a pre-Christian Alexandrian Jewish canon that's included in the Apocrypha. And he notes this by saying, quote, "These manuscripts that we have are 4th and 5th century Christian works, and they fail to agree on the extent of these extra books, and seem to have compiled more with convenience of references in mind than the standards of canonical versus non-canonical books." And in this footnote that is mentioned, he says, quote, "Codex Vaticanus omits the 4 books of Maccabees." So in other words, do you have any of the books of Maccabees? No, you do not have it in this particular Septuagint form that includes, the apocryphal books except Maccabees. Sinaiticus omits 2nd and 3rd Maccabees, though it presupposes their existence by including 4th Maccabees, thus numbered. Incidentally, also including the early Christian writings, Epistle of Barnabas, and the Shepherd of Hermas. So this particular work is exactly my point, that if you have a Septuagint here, this Septuagint codice also contains the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas. Should that then mean, because it's included in that particular Septuagint copy, that it is, the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas fits canonical status? Surely not. Alexandrianus is the most comprehensive, that adds the Psalms of Solomon, as well as the early Christian texts, 1st and 2nd Clement, which 2nd Clement is recognized to be a forgery, by the way. The appearance in Codex Alexandrinus of a book of odes, a collection of biblical hymns, parabiblical hymns like Prayer of Manasseh, and one Christian hymn, the Morning Hymn, which survives in the Gloria of many liturgical Christian traditions after the Psalms, also suggests interests of usage rather than strict limitation to canonical status. So, continuing where we left off with that, where the footnote, was posted, it says, as church books, they might have sought to contain what was useful rather than what was strictly canonical. These manuscripts do bear witness, however, to usage in the church and to differences in usage from region to region in the 4th century. The fact that the books of the Apocrypha are interspersed among the other Old Testament books does show that the communities that produced these manuscripts did not share a consciousness of a closed Old Testament canon corresponding to the rabbinic canon. So, concerning that, we have right there the fact that, including especially going to the manuscripts of these codexes that contain the apocryphal books, if we're going to say that because it was included in the Septuagint, in certain manuscripts, that means that it should be viewed canon. If that's the argument, then you may as well say that Clement, the first and second Clement, is canon. The Clement of Rome's epistle, the first one, that's canon. That the Epistle of Barnabas is canon because it is mentioned in, Codex Alexandrinus, and then eventually, Codex, I believe that was Sinaiticus or Vaticanus, I forgot at the moment, but you can go back and listen to what I was saying, and you'll get the point. Point being that with those particular apocryphal works, you have some issues there. Now, that being said, to me, it's interesting with the route that the apologists of Rome go to, the lengths they will do to defend their doctrines and to defend their false beliefs. And that's what kind of shocks me about most of what occurs. So going to some of the tweets, for example, just to show you an idea of what we're dealing with when it comes to this particular vulgar apologist of Rome. We have, for example, I mentioned Josephus. He says, quote, "So you are using the Palestinian canon made by Jews who rejected Christ and assuming those Jews had the oracles." And of course, he refuses to. And then of course, they always ask, when you start quoting, Romans 3:2, to use it like, well, how do you know that the book of Romans is canon? And so when you explain it, he says, that's circular reasoning. So he wants to use the genetic fallacy, but then accuses me of circular reasoning. Well, I of course ask, is circular reasoning always bad? And so it's a logical fallacy. Well, I tried looking this up, and after realizing and analyzing this, circular reasoning is not always fallacious. In fact, there is a thing on the Logical Fallacies website that there are exceptions to the rule. That there are some times that we had to employ circular reasoning because it's the only way we can get something. For example, how do I know that my reasoning skills are reliable? So in order to detect and test my reasoning skills to see if they are indeed reliable, I must use my reasoning skills. And then for memory, how do I know that my memory skills and my memory is reliable? Some people have to take a memory test, but guess what? That utilizes your own memory. So you have to use your memory to help detect and solve the question, is your memory reliable? So you have to sometimes, in certain circumstances, employ the usage of circular reasoning. But even then, with the usage of going to the text, this is something that every critical scholar of every work does when they're examining certain issues, is to examine the text. And when they examine the text, focusing on an internal as well as an external examination and critique, they can come to the conclusion of who was the author, when was this dated, and what time period was used, and what is this sort of person that would have authored it. So, I mean, when people start learning how we engage in the scholarly realm, I think that would make a lot of people more safe and feel a little bit better about themselves. So, concerning that, I think that's mostly what we need to say about that. Because, I mean, the Apocrypha cannot consistently defend itself. In fact, even as noted in De Silva's book, this is the last time I'm going to be going to it, I swear, concerning page 18, it says, by the 2nd century BCE is clear evidence of an awareness of a set of sacred authoritative writings. Sometimes this is spoken as a two-part collection, as the Law and the Prophets. What includes this citation? 2nd Maccabees 15:9, 4th Maccabees 18:10. So you have a reference to the entire Old Testament as the Law and the Prophets. And in fact, another thing, and this is also another BCE, so you can't say, well, this person rejected Christ. This was the grandson of Ben Sira, and this was in his prologue of the Greek translation of Ben Sira, otherwise known as Ecclesiasticus or Sirach. And this is what we read, that, you know, this is the, you know, the zeal in studying, quote, the law and the prophets and the other books of our ancestors. So, with that being kept in mind, the issue is then going to the fact that the Protestant canon we have, that is what is canonical. It has been recognized even in the BC era. So, I would rather go with what Romans 3:2 says, which is that the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God, and as a result, we must give their testimony, especially if some of the testimony comes from the BC period, some significant weight. There. Give myself a drink real quick. Delicious. Now, another issue. Now, I have had conversations with people about, Calvinism and all that, and it's quite interesting whenever those conversations happen, because it's also a chance for people to actually learn what we Calvinists affirm, what we Calvinists believe. Because there are people who like to misrepresent it, there are people who like to lie about it. And in fact, there was even a tweet that I saw where someone said, Jesus is saying to you Calvinists that he never knew you, you workers of iniquity, you preachers of lawlessness. And so somehow he believes that we Calvinists believe in lawlessness. And so as a result of that, they want to say, that we're against the law, that we believe you can do whatever you want, how you will, just how things go, apparently. And I find that to be a bit disingenuous, a bit dishonest, in my opinion. But hey, that's just me, So this goes back to a conversation that I had with JMD Apologetics, and the main host, the guy, not the one person that contributes to the website that I debated, which was great. Already forgetting his name, because I gotta be honest, that debate that we had on can women be pastors in the church or have some authoritative roles in the church, that was probably one of the worst debates I've had, in all honesty. And so I don't know, man. I mean, it's one of those days, that's for sure. That's strange, and it's going to be taking me a while to find that. I guess I forgot to save it to the debate playlist as soon as it was done. So, well, it's now there. It's there now, so eat your heart out. Praise. That was his name. the Shepherd's Chapel disciple. Anyways, so he's the one who, that Praise is the one that does the silent videos, and it's usually coming from JMD Apologetics, who does the ones with the voice, and he's always in the thing where, like, we got a Patreon and all that. That's his voice. So concerning him, we had a discussion on Ask RC Apologist, and this is actually on the channel at the Ask RCA highlight, which is why cussing is a sin, and then we go over is the issue of modalism, a damnable heresy, and does that make one a heretic? And I would say yes, it does. And for some reason, during that, someone has to have some people, I don't call it this. This is what some people on the internet call anti-Calvinist syndrome. And that is that in any conversation that comes up, you just got to bring up Calvinism. You just got to bring it up and try to straw man and lie about what certain people believe. So when it has been explained to JMD before about what it is we had believed and what we as Calvinists affirm, we go into that, and he just simply says, well, if everything's predetermined, then why do anything? Why decide to make choices if you have no ability to make choices? We do have the ability to make choices. We've told you this before, and I'm wondering if this will still sink into your head when this happens. But we do affirm the ability to make decisions, and I just hope that gets through to you. And then, of course, why preach or evangelize, if everything's predetermined? Because God ordains the ends as well as the means. So in other words, we, no matter what we do, even us just resting or relaxing, whatever decision we make has already been preordained. And we make that decision, and we make the decision because of the influence of the Holy Spirit that we have concerning the call to go evangelize. And because the fact that God has ordained that this incident would happen. That is why we make the decision. We make the decision. So we do not deny decision making in Calvinism, and I wish that some of these people, including JMD, would stop lying and misrepresenting our position. Because I swear this is disingenuousness at its best. So when it comes to what Calvinists believe, don't say, oh, you deny decision making, or why try to argue this debate if it's already been determined what one person will have. That's the other thing. The guy that was on HistoryNet, aka the White Engine, that was on the other day on Twitter, he had mentioned, well, why have these free will debates? I'm just going to continue on believing I have free will. Maybe you won't. You ever thought about that? I used to say that I would go on believing in free will. I would basically be like Geddy Lee from Rush and have that song. You go, I will choose free will. And I've just humiliated everybody, including myself, with that particular set of songs right there. Free will is not something that is chosen because free will doesn't exist. It's just simply the fact that you make decisions. That automatically isn't free will. Free will, if you want to define that, then yes, we Calvinists do affirm free will. But free will means that the will of man is completely free and autonomous from the governing authorities of the world, whether it be nature, whether it be God. That is free will. And to consistently affirm that kind of free will, you have to be an open theist at that point. And of course, there goes into Molinism, which is a whole nother can of worms that I think is, an issue of problems, but I don't say that as an unbiblical and unchristian perspective. I think middle knowledge is a stretch, but most of the other parts of Molinism I don't think we can condemn as unbiblical concepts. So it's just things like that that kind of frustrate me when it comes to the Calvinist debate, because, people don't represent Calvinism correctly when they're trying to debate it and attack it. And I would just simply advise that, just start being consistent and actually represent what we say. Now, the final thing we're going to go into before we end the show is a video that was done by a YouTuber and a guy that's on the Twitter, and he's a blogger too. He decided to make this into a video because it had a lot of information about it. And I'm going to accept some of the criticisms here, as well as, go over some of the problems with as mentioned in the video. Some of y'all may remember I did the documentary hypothesis debunked video. And, people have said that, I didn't represent it accurately enough. And some people just were insulting to the point, and said that I had no idea what I was, looking into. Now, we're going to look at someone who I thought did a very well done video and commentary on the subject. And that is Amateur Exegete. So, we're going to take a look at listen to his video. Now, I'm going to do what some of the people are doing these days, and that is to help save up on time. Its speed on the YouTube is at 1.25 times. So it's going to be a little faster than its usual thing, but I'll leave the link to the original video in the description in the links below. So feel free to check it out. All right, so let me first get my chair relaxed and ready and move the mic, and we should be ready to go. So here we go with the particular video in mind. So let's go.
This is the Secular Bible Study. I'm the Amateur Exegete. Last month, Reformed Christian apologist published a video on his channel entitled Documentary Hypothesis Debunked, Proving Mosaic Authorship. For those unfamiliar with R.C. Apologist, he's a Calvinist Christian who conducts apologetic work both on and off the web. And while I disagree with him on a host of issues, I enjoy engaging with him and hearing his perspective. And I always like it when he pushes back against bad apologetics, especially when it comes from S.J. Thomason. His video on the documentary hypothesis caught my eye because I find the hypothesis to be a very compelling, albeit imperfect, explanation for the origin of the Torah.
So notice right off the bat, just in case y'all need to catch that, he says that it is for him a good explanation, albeit imperfect explanation. So just keep that in mind.
If a strong argument can be made against it, then I am eager to hear it. So, with that said, let's dive in.
RC here, and today we are going to be dealing with the documentary hypothesis, which to me is a now failed thesis on the topic of Old Testament textual criticism.
We need to stop for just a second and clarify a couple of things. The documentary hypothesis falls into the category of source criticism, not textual criticism.
All right, and this is understandable, and I do accept this form of criticism here that is addressed. I had heard of source criticism, so not to say I wasn't familiar with the term or the concept entirely, just wasn't completely defined, and I have actually a couple of books on source criticism, just haven't had the time to look into them versus some of the other books that I've had. But I'm sure now that I actually know the name and the title of this kind of criticism, I can go into it a lot more. And in fact, I found out that New Testament criticism, textual criticism, does actually deal in some ways with source criticism of the New Testament, because if you're familiar with the Q source and the L and such that is mentioned, that's technically source criticism in the New Testament, because you're then dealing with a source. So I guess then we have this other source criticism that is mentioned, particularly in the Old Testament. So I accept correction here, but notice that at the same time, when I read textual criticism books, they always mention source theory, source criticism material. So that's kind of probably where I got mistaken in usage of the term there. So just don't hold that against me. Just saying, this I'm willing to learn. So that's why I'm glad people can make responses like this that I can be able to respond to. So let's continue onward.
It is understandable why R.C. apologists or anyone else might confuse the two. After all, the hypothesis is about the biblical text. So isn't that textual criticism? As biblical scholar Joel Baden has said, the documentary hypothesis begins with the canonical text and the literary problems that require explanation. But strictly speaking, textual criticism is about the readings found in the texts themselves. It analyzes the various manuscripts and versions of biblical texts we possess and tries to ascertain what the original reading or readings would have been. And textual criticism is, for biblical scholars, the most fundamental of all criticism, because without a text, there is nothing to analyze. Source criticism, on the other hand, in some ways tries to look behind the texts themselves to tease out any possible source material. For example, in New Testament studies we have the synoptic problem, which is an attempt to find a solution as to why the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke appear to be so similar. They all show some kind of literary dependence, but upon which gospel are Gospels? Similarly, in Pentateuchal studies, scholars recognize problems inherent in the biblical text and suggest solutions, one of which is that the author or authors utilize source material. The documentary hypothesis is one such solution.
There are people today who adhere to this thesis, which states that pretty much 4 individual sources exist in which the...
I find it interesting that, when I am talking in this particular, because I got it on that fast speed, that my voice is just, as well as the music, is like, dun, 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 dun. It's like just a lot faster than it was, and so instead of relaxing, it's almost like it's getting ready for a rap beat or something. I don't know, just a quick comment I wanted to make there.
Composition of the Torah was done.
That's the general gist of the documentary hypothesis. Generally speaking, there are 4 sources. The J, or Yahweh's source, which in the pre-Exodus narratives routinely uses the name Yahweh, and in Genesis seems to emphasize those locations associated with what would become Judah. The E, or Eloh's source, which insists upon using the name Elohim for God, and also seems to emphasize locations in what would become the northern kingdom of Israel. The D, or Deuteronomistic source, which makes up the book of Deuteronomy, and was likely originally a product of priests working in the northern kingdom. And P, the priestly source, which emphasizes Israelite religious values and rituals, and often refers to God as Elohim. There is considerable debate over when the sources were written down, as well as when they were compiled and edited. Richard Elliott Friedman, one of the most vocal proponents of the hypothesis today, has suggested the following scenario. The Yahwist source originated in the southern kingdom of Judah sometime between the 10th and 8th centuries BCE. During the same time, in the northern kingdom, a priest had composed the Elohist source. In 722, the Assyrians attacked Israel, exiling some of its inhabitants. And some invariably made their way to Judah. And it was there and then that a redactor combined the J and E sources together to make what is referred to as JE, or RJE, the R standing for redactor. Most biblical scholars believe that the priestly source was composed sometime in the 5th or 6th centuries, probably after the destruction of Jerusalem by Babylon.
So, before I let him finish there, he said, he mentioned he highlights what Friedman's view is. So he says, in 10th to 8th century BCE, there's the formation of the J in Judah, and then the E in Israel's source. So, what primary sources from these, whether they be from historical documents or from original manuscript documents, concerning any of the primary sources versus secondary sources, such as Friedman's would be considered a secondary source, leads us to make this conclusion other than simply making speculations on, as the, we're kind of going to rewind a bit, which would take away what was said earlier, but we're going to try to get back on track. Yahweh uses the J source uses the Yahweh, and presented in anthropomorphic terms. The E source, says that it uses Elohim. Deity is remote. Emphasis on prophets. If we're focusing on this for distinction, why that? Why not that any time that there's an anthropomorphic reference, why not describe that to the Elohist source? Why not describe that to the priestly source? So how do you come to these conclusions of ascribing certain attributes besides, the D is the Deuteronomist source, so meaning that whatever's in Deuteronomy is, that's a particular source, and saying that it's likely originated in the northern kingdom of Israel I would be interested in seeing the primary sources or anything that can help us understand how that would come to the conclusion. Alright, so...
And then that a redactor combined the J and E sources together to make what is referred to as JE, or RJE, the R standing for redactor. Most biblical scholars believe that the priestly source was composed sometime in the 5th or 6th centuries, probably after the destruction of Jerusalem by Babylon in 586. Friedman disagrees and argues that such a date is ruled out by linguistic evidence. He favors a date closer to the 8th or 7th centuries, around the time when J and E were edited together. The final main source, the Deuteronomistic source, was compiled in stages. This likely took place during the reign of King Josiah, around 622 BCE. D was originally a part of the longer Deuteronomistic history, which included Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. Then, sometime after D was completed, a redactor put together all 4 sources and formed what we know today as the Torah, or the Pentateuch. Interestingly, Friedman thinks that the redactor was none other than Ezra the scribe.
So concerning where this all begins, it mostly began with a French physician named Jean Astruc with his book Conjectures on Genesis. This mostly began with him seeing the different references to God by either Yahweh or Elohim as being the work of composing the book of Moses from 2 different sources. The Yahweh references were part of the J source, or the Yahwist source, where the Elohim references were part of the E source, or Elohist source. So supposedly, 2 different groups who referred to God under a different name with different theologies in mind.
Astruc's work was published in 1753, and its full title was Conjecture on the Original Documents that Moses Apparently Used in Composing Genesis. As R.C. Apologist points out, Astruc saw that in some stories, God was referred to as Elohim, while in others he was referred to as Yahweh. Astruc's conjecture was that Moses, while writing the book of Genesis, utilized multiple sources, including those that biblical scholars now refer to as J, E, and P. But it is clear that Astruc didn't deny Mosaic authorship. Rather, he was simply trying to explain features within what Moses wrote. The use of various sources made the most sense to Astruc, and really, it isn't too radical a thought.
However, it eventually...
Alright, and there's a good point right there. So, again, I'm willing to accept correction on certain issues on that.
Actually evolved and was perfected by a man named Julius Wellhausen, who eventually added the priestly source and the Deuteronomic source. This is mostly the theory that is being pushed today by those who affirm the documentary hypothesis. While at a basic level, it can seem convincing, we must examine critically this critical theory against the authorship of Moses. Ironic how we have to examine critically a critical theory. Then we will try to make a brief case for the authorship of Moses in light of what we've learned.
Perfected is too strong a word. Wellhausen gave us the names for the 4 sources that biblical scholars think make up the Torah, but it is not as if all research on the hypothesis ceased when Wellhausen published his work on the issue. A lot has happened in the last 140 years.
So here's something to keep in mind. Much like the Exodus issue, this too is one where the majority consensus is in agreement with the J, E, P, and D theory. However, there are issues with this. First of all, simply having that as a reason to believe in the theory is nothing more than a mix of the appeal to authority fallacy and appeal to common belief fallacy.
I wholeheartedly agree that accepting the documentary hypothesis on the basis of consensus alone is invalid. But if we disagree with the consensus, we should probably have pretty good reasons for doing so, right?
Right, and I would hope also that, and this is why it didn't get covered in the particular video here, the case that I tried providing for Mosaic authorship. I'm hoping if there's going to be a response that deals with that.
Secondly, the evidence that may be in view by the majority of scholars may be nothing more than assumptions and stretches. Remember that when Astruc first founded the theory, this was merely a conjecture to him.
Yes, it's possible. So, we will need to look at the evidence to see if scholars are stretching or if there's something to it. To do that, we will need to look at specific texts. Unfortunately, this isn't something R.C. Apologist does. Instead of offering examples of the hypothesis at work, R.C. quotes various opponents of the hypothesis to get their analysis. There are no specific texts dealt with.
Many people point out...
Well, with the text that you have brought out, for example, the J and the E sources, okay, you have different names. And in terms of the different theologies that have been mentioned, that still doesn't explain, in terms of, a certain wording that is used alongside the supposed different sources, doesn't consistently explain why this goes to this source and why this is actually from a different source. I don't think that that's a decent argument that is able to be made. At least with the Q source, it seems to imply, and I think can actually have some consistency, but even then I still have my doubts about the Q source. But at least even then, what can be seen of the Q source can be either a written document which can be possible, or some sort of oral source of which they're getting this work. So, I mean, yeah.
That there are these 4 sources, but don't really tell us how we know it's the work of another source, or if there is a source at all in manuscript form. Old Testament scholar Walter C. Kaiser Jr. says the following, quote, "No one has ever seen such J, E, D, and P documents, or any allusions to them in any ancient literature, paralleling if the tenfold reference to the accounts and generations of in Genesis."
So, because we don't possess modern manuscripts that are wholly P or J or E or D, the hypothesis is invalid? So, does this mean we can reject the existence of other sources explicitly mentioned in the Bible, like the Book of Jasher, the Book of the Wars of the Lord, or the Book of the Acts of Solomon, because we possess no manuscripts of them? Surely R.C. Apologist wouldn't agree with that. Yet he continues.
And you're right. I will not agree with that, and that's why I will have to retract my statement on that particular issue. So again, I'm open to correction. I'm just pointing out that I'm willing to be corrected on certain issues. And I hope also that some of the atheists watch this, because I recognize that there are some that like to say that I don't take correction, or that I just, am arrogant and blind and will just say what I want without ever having to be corrected. Apparently not. I mean, I can be convinced based off of, I've always loved this quotation from James White, and that is, inconsistency is the sign of a failed argument. So I have to be consistent in my theology, and so far, if I have to have it that, going against someone like Amateur Exegete in this kind of video will help me do so, then so be it.
At least when scholars formulate theories, they do it based on actual other sources. There is 0 other sources besides trying to find phrases in the biblical text.
R.C. Apologist seems to be suggesting that if biblical scholars don't have an outside source to confirm the existence of the 4 sources that allegedly make up the Torah, then there is a major hole in the theory. The problem with this is his caricature of the documentary hypothesis generally, and how source criticism works particularly. But more on all that shortly.
Even the liberal scholarship books I've read didn't pull out these sources, but instead say these are things they think are likely due to different names and supposedly different theologies in the text.
R.C. Apologist mentions liberal sources that describe and defend the documentary hypothesis, but he never produces one. In the rest of the video, he never cites a single scholar who promotes or defends the documentary hypothesis. What was that about providing outside sources to promote an argument?
Well, the issue concerning the reason why I didn't mention them by name is because, again, there were definitely several that I had to look into concerning that. The Friedman, the one you mentioned, is one that I had heard about, especially by reading on Heiser, who mentions that, with Friedman's, either it was Friedman or Kugel, I forget which one that he mentioned, but I'm pretty sure it was Friedman, mentions the documentary hypothesis, and why Heiser finds that while Heiser may have a different view towards than I do on the issue, he definitely disagrees and thinks there's flaws and problems with Friedman's understanding and take on the hypothesis. But another one that was used is an old book that I got from an associate, and I'm trying to find where it is, because it is definitely something to keep in mind. I guess 1984 is when it was published. I think it was no, that wasn't it. It was a book called Introduction to the Old Testament, and it had like a bull on it. And so it was something that was definitely interesting. And it definitely was a liberal scholarship book. Like I said, I'm gonna have to try to do my best to find this particular work, because it was it was one of the introduction to the Old Testament books that you used in seminary back in the day, and this was used in the 80s. So with that was one of them. I didn't bring that particular book with me, but I guarantee and rest assured I do indeed have that book. Then there was, in trying to examine this particular issue, I've been looking into some of the other books that have been well recommended in terms of scholarship, and that was Dictionary of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, which is a book that is, Dictionary of the Old Testament Pentateuch, also known as a compendium of contemporary biblical scholarship, with the general editors T. Desmond Alexander and David Day Baker. I forget who the scholar was that contributed to the specific dictionary entry on Moses and Mosaic authorship and such. But concerning that, it kind of read liberal in the theory, since it was kind of leaning toward the idea of, it's possible Moses didn't create these sources, or author this book, but instead it's from these sources and such. So I mean, you have other people that are in likewise holding to this particular view. So those are just a few bits of the scholars, if you're wanting specific names of them. So I mean, it wasn't intentional. I was just trying to not make the video longer than it already was. That was the whole point.
There has been the release of a book by a Jewish scholar named Umberto Cassuto called The Documentary Hypothesis. That is old, but it has been the start of what becomes the declining of the consistency of the documentary hypothesis.
The declining of the consistency of the documentary hypothesis? Huh?
Yeah, the declining of the consistency of the documentary hypothesis, meaning that at some point, like I said, at its basic level, without any opponents challenging the theory, challenging the hypothesis, it sounds decent and consistent enough in its approach. But by the time we see someone in the scholarly field get in and actually challenge it, then that's where we start seeing the holes, the gaps, the inconsistency of the theory that is the documentary hypothesis.
Before we continue, let's show how Cassuto debunks the hypothesis claims of names of God and the literary style / vocabulary of their claims. The first is mostly dealing with the J and the E sources that say Yahweh and Elohim are from two different sources. Concerning this, Cassuto says this about the Torah and the names. Quote, "It selected the name Yahweh when the text reflects the Israelite conception of God, which is embodied in the portrayal of Yahweh and finds expression in the attributes traditionally ascribed to him by Israel, particularly in his ethical character. It preferred the name Elohim when the passage implies the abstract idea of the deity prevalent in the international circles of wise men. So just because there are different Hebrew words used to refer to God does not automatically imply that they are different names to other gods."
A couple of things. First, no one is arguing that when the priestly or Elohist sources use Elohim and the Yahwist source uses Yahweh, that they are referring to two different deities. That isn't the argument. All of the sources are Jewish and reflect Jewish beliefs, and the Jews historically were henotheistic, with their God as the supreme deity.
The Jews were actually not henotheistic, and that cannot be demonstrated. In fact, we actually had a discussion over that with me in Inspiring Philosophy, where though he would say and use the term henotheist, that the early Jews were henotheists originally. He would cite Michael Heiser to support that, based on the usage of the council of the gods, the divine council and all that. But in reality, that's not the case. With concerning that it's not henotheism. In fact, even Heiser notes that wasn't henotheism. People tried using his work to promote that, but he said that would be then being disingenuous and dishonest in applying that work. And that's why even some YouTuber who's part of the Arian Church, the Arian Orthodox Church is what he calls it, criticized Heiser for, because people used Heiser to support that, and they're saying that, they're disingenuous. And that's when they, start hating Heiser as soon as that gets mentioned. So no, there was no henotheism, and the people that would think that, especially in application with the term of Elohim, is being very gross in its application of the term Elohim that is used, and the history of the ancient Jewish people.
And eventually made the move to a stricter monotheism.
They were always
monotheists. The issue
monotheists.
at heart is about when the divine name Yahweh was first used. According to Exodus 6:2-3, the patriarchs did not know God's name was Yahweh, but instead that it was God Almighty, or El Shaddai. But
now, we actually already addressed this. In fact, this was also went over in the previous theological discussion with a White Engine. So if you want to check that out, me and HistoryNet doing the discussion there, feel free to go and do so. So yeah, that being said,
throughout the book of Genesis, it is painfully clear that they did know him as Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
In Genesis 12:8, Abram pitches his tent in between Bethel and Ai, builds an altar to Yahweh, and per the text, invoked the name of Yahweh. In Genesis 14:22, Abram tells the king of Sodom that he has sworn to Yahweh, God Most High. In Genesis 15:2, Abram refers to God as Lord Yahweh. A few verses later, in verse 7, God says to Abram, I am Yahweh who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans. So it's clear that the patriarchs did know God by his name Yahweh. So we are either left with a very obvious contradiction that a single author could have easily avoided, or we are looking at different stories with different names and different views of the God of Israel. For the J source, God was always known by his name Yahweh. But for the priestly source, God was known as Elohim or El Shaddai, but never Yahweh until the revelation to Moses.
Another point from Cassuto is the style and the language. Cassuto states, quote, we must not rely upon the difference in language in order to determine the origin of the sections, which we shall subsequently use to decide the linguistic characteristics of the sources. For in that case, we shall indeed fall into the snare of reasoning into a circle, nor consider words or forms mechanically, as though they were divorced from their context, and the latter could have no bearing on their use.
It's not merely that certain phrases are used and therefore belong to this or that cause. It's that certain terms and phrases are either consistently or universally used by particular sources. For example, the phrase gathered to his people is often used in the Torah as a way of saying someone died and was buried. It occurs 11 times, and all 11 times it is in the priestly source. The mountain upon which Moses received the commandments is referred to as Mount Sinai 20 times, all in the J source and the P source. It's also referred to as Horeb.
Now, here's the thing. Going back. So, gathered to his people. Abraham was gathered to his people and all that. Okay, why does gathered to his people, how does that constitute as being part of the priestly source? I mean, when someone look at that, like, gathered to his people, that sounds like something Moses wouldn't write. So does that mean it's part of a different source? Okay, which source? Let's put it in the priestly source. I'm trying to understand. Shall be gathered to. Where do we see that means it belongs to a specific source that is outside Mosaic authorship? I mean, it just small things like that. I think. I mean, it's like taking apart this David De Silva book and be like, well, he claims to have written the book, but there's certain words and phrases that we can find in this particular book that we can say maybe it was part of a different source. In fact, there was actually a book that was done by a lawyer that examined the styles of these two authors that co-authored a book together, and when examining the different chapters, using the method of these two critical people, they would say, well, by their own standard, their book was written by multiple different people and not by themselves because of certain stylistic differences and certain phrases that were used versus others. I mean, it's just things like that that make no sense to me. And then, as he explains later on, it's Mount Sinai versus Horeb and the Mountain of God, saying that Horeb and the Mountain of God is part of the E source, while Mount Sinai is part of the J source. Again, how do you distinguish and make that, or say that that's because it's part of a different source?
On which Moses received the commandments is referred to as Mount Sinai 20 times, all in the J source and the P source. It's also referred to as Horeb, or the Mountain of God, 14 times, but always in E and D. The phrase, with all your heart and with all your soul, occurs 8 times, but all in D. Many more examples could be brought forward.
Now, to go over another issue, the problem also exists with the fact that the theory has become too complicated than it even needs to be.
In what follows, R.C. Apologist quotes from David Stern's article, Recent Trends in Biblical Source Criticism. The gist of the quote R.C. presents is this: Because some scholars posit more sources than were part of Wellhausen's original hypothesis, this has caused the hypothesis to be totally undermined. And while it is true that too complicated a thesis doesn't typically bode well for that thesis, it isn't evidence against it. For example...
Right, I'm not trying to say that that's evidence against it. I'm simply saying that that should give us some skepticism of it, as you pointed out, that it does kind of weaken the whole point of the theory, and that has been noted by the scholars for that. And so that's why I try to simply point out that there are some flaws, so that then afterwards I can provide the case for Mosaic authorship afterwards, which I wish was dealt with in this video, but it wasn't, so hopefully there will be a response to that.
One source that Stern mentions is called the Grundlage, or G source. In the words of Norman Gottwald, G is an older pool of traditions that stand behind J and E. Gottwald writes, "This stock of thematically grouped traditions probably took shape in the cult, that is, formal worship assemblies, before the tribes of Israel opted for kings. Some of the differences in J and E may be due to different versions of the traditions circulating in the southern and northern regions of Israel. In any event, G would not stand for a single standard version, but would refer to a range of oral written variants within broadly fixed parameters. The G source is therefore a multitude of possible sources that stand behind the J and E sources. And this isn't all that alarming. Surely, before the sources were written down, there were oral traditions circulating upon which J and E were based. If Stern, or RC apologist, thinks that is overcomplicating the hypothesis, the problems really may lie elsewhere." Following his citing of Stern, RC continues.
So it gets complicated when we begin to actually narrow down our sources at this point. And while there's a majority consensus on a theory, not even that majority can reach a consensus on what sources apply to which text of the Torah.
This is plainly not true. Fundamentally, adherents to the documentary hypothesis accept the four basic sources, J, E, D, and P. That some have posited further background sources isn't a sign of a lack of consensus on the core four. It is simply source criticism at work, trying to get as far back as possible into the sources behind the biblical texts. We shouldn't confuse a lack of absolute agreement with a sense of consensus.
I didn't say, concerning the general consensus, I do believe that, there is a general consensus on the documentary hypothesis, and there are people that will still accept this. My point is simply that there are people that, especially concerning these other documents within the hypothesis, they'll accept J, E, P, D, then you have some that disagree about L and G, and then some of these others. That's what I'm mostly referring to.
Furthermore, the newer documentary hypothesis does away with all of the extra sources proposed, and instead focuses in on the standard four.
Well, thank God then. They're trying to, make it less complicated. So, at least they're doing something right.
Stern cites Pauline Viviano, who notes, quote, "The more sources one finds, the more tenuous the evidence for the existence of continuous documents becomes, and the less likely that four unified documents ever existed. Even for those able to avoid skepticism and confusion in the face of the ever-increasing number of sources, the only logical conclusion seems to be to move away from Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis toward a position closer to the fragmentary hypothesis."
Viviano's point in this critique isn't to discard totally the documentary hypothesis, but to discuss some of its weaknesses. And when she writes that, in the face of the ever-increasing number of sources, the only logical recourse seems to be to move away from the newer documentary hypothesis toward a position closer to the fragmentary hypothesis, what she's talking about is not discarding the idea of sources behind the Pentateuch, but a different model for understanding how the Pentateuch came to be. In the fragmentary, or supplementary hypothesis, an original source work was edited over the years till it became the Pentateuch we have today. This still leaves Moses out of the picture, a case of out of the frying pan and into the fire. Viviano also writes in that same work, "Source criticism and the newer documentary hypothesis should not be discarded. Rather, both need to be re-evaluated and reconceived. We are rightly admonished to exercise caution in our re-evaluation of the newer documentary hypothesis, but a wholesale acceptance of the hypothesis that ignores its weaknesses is not advisable either. Certainly, we can no longer use the hypothesis as a basis for reconstruction of the history of religious development of Israel, nor even as a basis for Old Testament theology. Still, it has made a lasting contribution to our understanding of the Bible, moving scholarship away from the naive approach to the biblical text and opening up new possibilities of meaning. It has disabused us of the notion that the Bible is through and through literal history. For these reasons alone, if for no others, source criticism and the newer documentary hypothesis merit our appreciation." That additional information gives us a slightly different viewpoint on the documentary hypothesis and the newer documentary hypothesis than either Stern or R.C. apologists provided.
Well, again, I mean, like I said, there's of course also another liberal scholar that's been pointed out. And again, I even utilized a liberal scholar concerning this issue. But while there's points that she brought out, I also want to point out that concerning it, I was just simply pointing out what she had said that should cause us not to simply dismiss it entirely. Again, just because some scholar says something doesn't mean that that person's right. So I wasn't saying because of the fact that, an issue gets more complicated, that means we should, completely forsake it. Because as is pointed out, and this is actually, as mentioned in the slide here, in the next pages, where she's talking about this stuff, about a newer documentary hypothesis, and it shouldn't be discarded. But I still believe we should still examine these things. Just that the newer documentary hypothesis issues didn't necessarily get dealt with in too much detail. The main issue is going over the documentary hypothesis as it has been used by most of the modern people today, some of which still cling to the traditional format, at least the people that I have dealt with.
Finally, on this point, ancient Near East and Old Testament scholar John D. Currid notes that, quote, very few scholars today accept the documentary hypothesis we originally formulated. The issue of authorship has become much more complex. There is, in reality, little consensus among scholars regarding who wrote what and when, even though they continue to use the acronym JEDP. So somebody can say that the majority of scholars agree on this, but at this point, it's evolved to being a much more complex issue with the different hypothetical sources. Heck, there's a doubt being casted on the existence of an E-source at this point, since some of these other sources showed up.
The consensus is on the existence of the sources, not on who wrote them. That's the heart of the hypothesis. And while it is true that the dating of those sources can differ, we can offer up a range of plausible dates for each source and acknowledge that there is debate over those dates. That doesn't invalidate the hypothesis. It just means that scholars aren't certain.
Okay, again, I'm not trying to simply invalidate. Now, when I say debunking the documentary hypothesis, what I'm trying to do with the whole thing is that this hypothesis has some flaws, some things that are indeed false, and one of which is simply just ascribing something just because, it seems like it fits a different pattern or category, when nor does it seem to indicate that that's the case. If that's the case, we can do that with any book we have today and try to ascribe a certain source and apply source criticism to our modern books and literature today. So, I don't know, there's just a problem with that.
And there is nothing wrong with uncertainty.
Which means if you want to prove to me that this is going to be factual, you need to show me evidence and consistency to support the hypothesis based on actual manuscript documents of these supposed sources, as well as that your arguments can stay consistent.
Again, R.C. Apologist doesn't make it plain that he has read any of the relevant literature on the topic, as he doesn't provide any citations or examples put forward by proponents of the hypothesis. All we see...
So while I haven't done it in the video, I will let you know now that I have looked into it, and I didn't cite them, but there are people that I have looked into that do affirm this position, and I have the sources back at my house as well as on my iPhone and computer. So I didn't just blindly go into it. I even had to listen to Floyd FP on YouTube, who was given a decent talk about this whole thing. So, that being said, let's continue.
Is commentary from its opponents. And his statement that he will only accept it if he sees manuscripts supporting it is again problematic, as we previously discussed. Does he reject the existence of the Book of Jasher or the Book of the Wars of the Lord? We have no manuscripts of those works. Does R.C. doubt their existence as well?
No.
The point is, the documentary hypothesis rests on internal textual data. Whatever sources the redactor or redactors had are long gone, but they are found in the text themselves if the hypothesis is correct. But we can tease them out by examining the text themselves. The documentary hypothesis is by no means perfect. There are issues that must be dealt with by scholars, and it is very likely that in a century the hypothesis will look very different than the one proposed today. As we are able to examine the relevant texts, increase our understanding of biblical Hebrew in all its stages, and develop new theories in source criticism, we will arrive at a better understanding of just how the Torah came together. In my estimation, R.C. Apologist has not debunked the documentary hypothesis because he hasn't actually engaged with it. Rather, he has selected those scholars with whom he already sides, those scholars that fit his position, and he has not bothered to analyze examples of the hypothesis at work. Nor has he revealed an understanding of how source criticism works. He has claimed to have dived deep into the liberal scholarship, but where are the sources? After all, aren't we supposed to be skeptical of sources for which there is no direct evidence? This is the Amateur Exegete.
Alright, so that was the video. That was it. The Richard Elliott Friedman, The Bible with Sources Revealed. And then, of course, who wrote the Bible. I think that one, I believe, is what I saw at Books A Million when I had heard of it. Alright, so concerning that particular video that was just played, I mean, I've given my response and my thought to it. I mean, unless he wants to send me some books that deals with it in more detail, then he knows how to contact me, and we'll get that out of the way. But yeah, mostly I would just say that based on what was said, still there was no proving of a good case for the documentary hypothesis. It still was, these statements, and because these certain statements say something, versus, for example, saying a mountain of Sinai, and then and just saying mountain, then that means it's a different source. I mean, to me, that just does not. I don't see how that makes any sense to do that. So, I mean, again, I would be also waiting to see if the case, what you're making of the case for Mosaic authorship, when that video will be released by you. So, who knows? We'll probably get to that one day. But anyways, that has been all that we have on the show today. We're going to end in prayer, and then we're going to, take it away, and I'm going to go get some grub, and we'll see how that goes. But yeah, stay classy and be you, but, don't be a heathen and all that, you know what I'm saying? But anyways, alright, so let's end in prayer, and I'll see you next time. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this podcast. We thank you for the discussion that we've involved ourselves in over the topics. We ask that you use this content, Lord, to edify those who believe, and that you guide those who are listening, that you be with them, that you may grant them your wisdom, Lord, so that they may grow in grace, and they may grow in knowledge of your word, Lord. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.